In this video, I want to talk about the applications of notions of the common good or the general welfare and their applicability to advocacy for an anarcho-capitalist system. Now, in general, and up, through most of my life, my political life anyway, I've been very, very reluctant to use these terms or to address these terms, except in the extent that I've condemned them, because there are lots of intellectual problems with terms like general welfare and common good. I think Hayek said it very well in Road to Serfdom. I won't quote him exactly because I don't recall the quote exactly, but it is not a sufficiently definite concept to offer any particular course of action. So uh, in practice, notions of the common good are not empirical or scientific or strictly rational or non-contradictory. They are rationalizations for anything. So the eye of the beholder can determine society to be this or that and label it as the common good or the general welfare and then advocate policies along those lines when there's no rigorous scientific or rational basis to have that definition of the common good. So I'm not going to say that's not the case any longer, that I think that they're really concrete ideas that are particularly useful. However, I am going to say that even if we accept that potentially there is such a thing, I think it's interesting that any rigorous attempt to formulate social systems based on that as an ideal, the most good for the most people, the common good, the general welfare, um, tends to, in almost all cases, lead to, if not anarcho-capitalism, awfully damn close. Um, there's a few exceptions. One, and I forget the term, I think it's called Pelagogian. I read it on a Brian Kaplan article relatively recently. And that is the assertion basically that whatever exists is optimal in some sense. That, uh, you know, whatever flaws we might point out in the system, they're not really flaws because we accept them. That's the system that we have. And that's the system that quote unquote society has chosen. Again, a problem here is the aggregation of all humanity, uh, uh, anthropomorphizing it into an individual society, and then ascribing it, a whim and a will and a desire and volition and action, when that's not the case. There are individuals within society. If we want to aggregate them and speak abstractly of society, it's not necessarily wrong, but then to start prescribing it volitional acts like deciding that we should have a government, or deciding that we should have taxes, or deciding that we should be Christian or whatever, is very problematic. But uh, there's a kind of, this is the optimal state because that's what exists. Um, Obviously, there's lots of problems with this. Very few people really hold to this. If this is literally your position, then you should not ever advocate for any changes whatsoever. Any change is wrong, because that's not the way the system is. And then it leads to the contradiction that once the system inevitably changes, and it will in some regard at some point, you are struck with the intellectual contradiction of something having been right and then becoming wrong, or vice versa. So this would mean slavery was fine, it was accepted, and in that time you would say it was okay. When it became unokay, then that's your new position. And the fact that there's a huge contradiction would have to not be considered a problem. It also, and I guess I've already said this, it means reform of any type is wrong. Advocacy of reform of any type, it's kind of, I don't want to say it's wrong, but it doesn't make any sense within this system. If whatever we have is, if whatever we have you feel is to be optimal, you could say, well, my advocacy of a change is within the current existing thing, so there's nothing wrong with it, but then there's no reason to do it. The other conception that justifies the state is to simply assert that, and this is a great equivocation, that the state and society are the same thing. Anything that the state does or says it's doing is, by definition, optimal in some sense. And so, we can have a theoretical debate, but it really doesn't matter, because if the state says it's doing something for our own good, or whatever it is doing, is satisfies notions of the common good. So if your notion of the common good or the general welfare just says whatever the state asserts or does is ipso facto the common good. Again, I don't know. I've seen people who make arguments that sort of imply this quite a bit. I don't know. I don't know if I've ever heard anyone say this explicitly, because I think it's patently absurd. Because this would mean no act by any government at any point in history, and I don't care if we use the most infamous cliched examples, could be considered wrong by this definition. Everything, slavery, Holocaust, genocide, gulags, NSA spying, war, everything would meet that standard as for the common good. Because the state did it, hence society is, and the state is society, or the state is the mouthpiece, or the transcendent manifestation of society. There's problems with that too. I grant fully that society, or the state, is a component of society. There's no question. Every person is part of society. If we're going to say society is the aggregate of all people, then certainly that would include the state. But that also includes the Catholic Church and the Boy Scouts and McDonald's and biker gangs, Hell's Angels, the Bloods, the Crips, everything. And why aren't any other groups, granted the, very priest-like distinction of speaking for, interpreting, or manifesting the will of society generally, as if government government employees or politicians are somehow able to magically channel this, humanization, the society personified. Maybe it's the magic of elections. This is a weird thing. Like maybe if by voting, like the wisdom of society is channeled into their brains, and what flows out of their mouth because of that is actually our society itself articulating the general will. That's a very bizarre kind of concept. I've never heard it explicitly put forward, although it's implicit in a whole lot of arguments that I've heard. But other than those two, any other attempt to come to some kind of rational or scientific notion of the common good, or the most good for the most people, some Benthamite notion, and for a long time, I kind of viewed like Jeremy Bentham as like evil and all that. I think you still end up, when you start looking at it, you inevitably come up with either constructing some kind of objective theory of value, which is very problematic. But even if we grant that it might be possible in certain circumstances, it becomes very hard to envision that the state, as it exists now, or as it ever has existed, or even as it possibly could exist, would actually meet those criteria. The best explanation that I can think of, and I've never heard one that's even remotely as good, as problematic as it may be, is the one based on mutual exchange. If you have, the types of exchanges we have are unilateral or bilateral, or if one person agrees and another person doesn't, well, that's at the very least socially neutral, if not socially negative, because you have one person gaining at another one's disadvantage. Whereas if they both agree, then they both socially gained. I think that's clearly the most workable, most sensible one that I can think of. But even if we thought of some kind of objective theory, it's hard to see how the state fits in with that, because if we're talking about like economic growth, it's hard to see. It's very clear when you look at the actions of government agents that they're very much geared towards their own self-aggrandizement. Now, people tend to have a hard time understanding that. I'm not sure why. I think the democratic philosophy is largely responsible for that. I think that's the whole point, is to give the oligarchy a veneer of what's the word, egalitarianism, or I don't know, broader social basis than it did before. I mean, in my previous video, I pointed out, with the monarchies, it's so evident that the every law, everything that the monarchies did. We can talk not just about the Stuarts in England, but any monarchy ever, is for their benefit. Um, and yet you put on some sort of franchise, some sort of electorate, and then people find this hard to believe. But it's clearly not the case. I think part of it is we've been conditioned that, if a politician is being self-serving, then they will only do a certain type of behavior. So graft or overt bribes or political corruption, that would be considered selfish. But other activities are considered unselfish when clearly they are. Um, the vast majority of government, by the way, are not elected politicians; they're bureaucrats, and some of and at the bottom, most of them are motivated simply by the desire to have a steady income. We can talk about altruism all we want, but they get paid for what they do, and they expect to get paid for what they do. And if they're asked to work without pay, they don't do it. In fact, they'll go on strike or try and go on strike. They're always complaining that they should get paid more for the amount of work that they do and that they should have more time off. Whether we're talking about the police or the firemen or the teachers or whoever else works for the state, this is ever and always their critique, which is interesting. What's the pretense of them being altruistic when they want money, they want money, they want money. They also want other things. If you have a will to dominate, if you want to be a bully, I just saw the Onion had a great satirical, but not entirely satirical article about um, mentally unstable bully with things to prove, thinking about joining the police force, something like that. Um, if you have that desire, then it's selfish for you to become a cop because it's something that you can um, use as an outlet for your own personal desires. And even if you're not like a sadist, even if you're like a good cop who wants to help people, then it's an outlet, it's a selfish outlet for you to help people. Although I think that is a much, much less common uh, motivation than the former. Uh, when you look at politicians, people say, but they don't get paid that much. Well, there are other perks the government, especially high office, offers besides money. Although the money is substantial, they'll automatically be given huge book deals. People don't even have to buy their books, by the way. Like George W. Bush's books, not that many people are really going to be that interested in reading them. But large foundations that are politically connected will just buy up all the copies. Now, that's not to say every president wouldn't have a high demand. I think a lot of people do buy Barack Obama's books, but he's going to become wealthy of that. He'll get all kinds of consulting deals, and his entire family will become wealthy because of it. And that's hardly the first perk. The other perks will, of course, be fame and power, both of which are offered. Um, I think that some of the people in the legislature really do just kind of want to be the socialite, center of attention kind of famous person. Others have a very strong will to power. They want to dominate other people, and the obvious place to go is the government for that. And I think most people in high office have a combination of the two. They like being on TV, they like being interviewed, they like being the toast of society. They probably like the graft, although they don't all necessarily need that because they have enough that they don't, need an underhanded bribe necessarily, but they like the power. And it's evident, this is the case. The other thing is uh, they have an incentive to increase government power without any kind of calculus of is this really good for society generally. There's no whenever bureaucracies have a life of their own, just like any other institution. There's even theories that all institutions, even non-government ones, have an ingrained um, preponderance to extend themselves and to grow. And because that's the incentive, if you're a bureaucrat and you work for the government, you have every incentive to want that bureaucracy to perpetuate as long as possible, because the longer it does, the more assured you are of an income. The larger it becomes, the more power that bureaucracy has, both within the government and through the population generally. And so the more power you have, even if the number of people grow, since there's usually some kind of seniority or hierarchy, your relative power to the new people will be greater. And so, you know, You can look at someone like J. Edgar Hoover here as maybe a more dramatic, an atypical example, but still an illustrative one. Who's somebody who kind of starts when there's very little, and by the end of his career, he's the head of basically a government within a government, a kingpin with enormous power to the point where he can't even be removed by the political elite. It's my understanding that he was in a position to blackmail any and all politicians, getting to the point of high office. Even if you were totally clean, he could manufacture anything and say, I will continue as director, and that'll be that. That's maybe an overly dramatic but not entirely uninstructive illustration of their. But the point is that growth of the bureaucracy, there's never any. Is this what's best for the most people? Is this some kind of calculus where we've come and figured, this would be the best thing for the American society, would be the government to have more power in this case. That consideration never occurs. It's possible that some politicians have a political platform that rhetorically reflects that somewhat, but when it becomes actual time for legislation, it almost generates no returns. Almost. It would be incorrect to say there's never any cuts ever of any type. There are every once in a while. They're always on the margins and relatively small compared to the net growth, but they do happen. Uh, Now, I think that there could be really savvy public choice liberal economists, economists who are not ANCAPs, who could say, look, in certain areas there are negative externalities and positive externalities, so like air pollution, or maybe copyright, or maybe sanitation, uh, or maybe things that are public goods, like I don't know, education or something like that. And they could say, these things are market failures to one degree or another, and so the most good for the most people wouldn't be anarchy. It would be a government that looks at all of those things and addresses them. It does some kind of calculation and determines, all right, how much what's the market failure in terms of air pollution, and it would have to be careful not to overcompensate. So if it said there can't be even one particle of air pollution anywhere and will kill anybody who has anything to do with it, obviously that would cut down on air pollution, but it would, the cost would be far greater than the benefits. So there has to be a cost-benefit analysis, and then maybe hypothetically that state would satisfy some kind of objective notion of the most good for the most people or the common good. The trouble is, no state that ever existed has met that standard or even made any attempt to model itself on that standard or even implemented that type of ideology on any aspect of its existence. So it is an entirely hypothetical state, or maybe theoretical state, not a actual state. States from our previous, and I think this is someplace where someone like David Friedman, who will admit things like negative externalities and positive externalities, is still an anarchist, because the historical fact is that even if we tried to set up a state for that purpose, and it would be very difficult to see how we could do that, how we could convince a government that has so much power aggrandized to it to say, what, just cut back to within this very, very essentially minarchist economic esoteric roles that is always debatable, that's always potentially getting eviscerated by new market conditions that render it irrelevant. There's no reason to ever expect any existing states to, at least voluntarily, accede to that kind of conception. And even if they did, they have every incentive subsequent to that to grow as big as possible. Um, Now, it's true the United States government was never uh, organized explicitly on that way, although you could make the argument that the Constitution and minarchism generally is kind of a recognition of this, that okay, there's maybe defense is a negative. I don't agree with that, by the way, but I'm just saying the argument could be made, that there's a negative externality for defense and for roads and for the post office, which is the one that's clearly the most obviously incorrect uh, negative externality or impossible market failure. But look what happened. We ended up with this government, and I don't think other than just making the argument that whatever exists is optimal, or whatever the government says is best for society is actually best for society, other than those two stances, I don't see how any stance you can come up with is going to conclude that what currently exists, or what exists in most of the world most of the time, is anything like optimal or what is achievable. And I say achievable, not utopian or perfect. That's no such thing. Um, I even question about striving for perfection, because if you're looking for something that's perfect, the real world is never going to be that, and so maybe you're going to be um, developing in a way that's unsustainable. I don't know. That's a different video, but um, the states, as they exist, have never kind of approached. It's so clear that states are self-interested, that the legislation that they enact, that they're when they take over court, which is interesting. They haven't always taken over courts. Historically, law and order has often not been in the purview of the state, but when they do, it is so clear that they use it to advance their own agenda, to have a double standard where its agents can't be prosecuted, or it's a much higher burden of proof to prosecute them, or a much lower burden for them to commit a crime. Um, the whole, instead of paying restitution to your criminal, now you pay a fine to the crown. Does anybody think that that is anything other than an attempt to aggrandize the state, you know, on some pretext, and not some, yeah, it would be better for society if the victims are then taxed and the aggressor is then given free room and board, or made to pay a fine to the king who wasn't actually wrong. I have a hard time seeing how anybody could justly claim that's idea. Just like I said in the previous video, it's kind of ridiculous to assume that um, Charles II, giving his younger brother James II the state of New York, was some kind of, this is what's best for the people there. We're just selflessly, without any thought of our own well-being, doing this out of the goodness of our heart. And we've spent a whole lot of time, because we're talking about thousands and thousands of people, right? Millions of acres of land. They must have scrutinized, looking at everything, reading all these treatises, going out and asking the scholars, what do you think? And then they concluded, yeah, my little brother should rule that entire area. uh, Come on. Clearly he's doing it, and you say, oh, you're just stop harping on the stewards. We don't live with the stewards. But when the Congress exempted itself from Obamacare, when Congress, when the president says never gets investigated for crimes, when he doesn't investigate his predecessors for crimes, when anybody who whistleblows on him, he attacks, like as viciously as he possibly can, pronouncing his guilt beforehand, by the way, in complete abrogation of the rule of law. It's not the rule of law, it's the rule of an oligarchy, and the law is a pretext. Not, and, I won't say that the law is 100% under the control of the state, because the legal system dates back and has roots that are far in advance of this state in particular, and even the progenitors of this state. But it still has an awful, it's granted itself enormous monopoly privileges in that area. And it's the same thing with monopoly. Why does it grant itself monopolies? Is that to help people? We're all taught that monopolies are bad for consumers, and yet the government grants itself monopolies all the time. Is that because they decided that that's the best thing? The best thing for the people is that there be a monopoly on mail carriers. The best thing for the people is that the FDA prevent there being drugs on the market, or whatever it is. Or, the most flagrant examples, the worst examples by far, are the wars. That it's the best thing for our people to invade Iraq, which had nothing to do with 9/11. Just by the by, nothing. Other than our aggression against Iraq it was one of the things that pissed off Al Qaeda. The other thing being other actions of the government. Everything that Al Qaeda listed in its fatwa, that bin Laden listed, was an unjustifiable action on the part of the U.S. government. It's funny that people come up with a logic then that retroactively says, well, those anti-Muslim actions before 9/11 are justified because 9/11. And difficult logic there, but people do actually do it quite seriously. A more contemporary example that I used before is taking away the barring of third party candidates from presidential debates. Is there any argument that has anything to do with what's best? Isn't there any? Yeah, it's good to hear new debate. I mean, all these liberals, they who get hard-ons over the Green Party. Wouldn't you think it would be a good idea to have them there? Maybe they won't win, but just to get their ideals out there, uh, and you know, or I mean, what's the justification for disqualifying them? And it's clear because it's not in the party's interest. And there's the parties, both parties derive their power from the government, and so they are incentivized to aggrandize that power to the maximum extent. And I know I have a friend who worked for a congressman in state government. And when I went to college, I was in the capital of Michigan, and he said that the bureaucracy there very much had a "don't rock the boat" attitude. That you guys, the politicians, and there were term limits in my state, so that you could only be elected twice, and you maybe could move up to the other house or under federal office, but that was it. And the bureaucrats are basically the idea of cutting their jobs is none of them thought, well, the state could get along. I mean, if you went back 10 years, there were 20% fewer of us who are employed. And maybe since the state's bankrupt, it would be the best thing for the state if maybe some of the pork in our salaries was cut out, or maybe they fired the least productive 20% or whatever. That never, ever enters into it. It's always, well, we need raises, and we need more employees, and we need more government programs here, here, and here. And this is at the state level, the federal level, whatever. Um, the dynamics slightly different at the federal level because they can print money, whereas the states have to borrow it. I mean, the federal government's borrowing it too, but they have a direct line, so to speak. And they have more power to tax, so they can borrow more. Um, just like if I was the landlord of one county as opposed to an entire continent, I could borrow more in the latter situation than the former. Uh, the interest is clearly that to expand the government, and then we have people who look at their proclamations of the need for government and say, well, look, it's obvious we need more government because the government says that they need more government. The government acts like they need more government. It's pretty obvious from anyone who's looking at it with any degree of objectivity or intellectual honesty that there is a strong motivation, if not all the time in every instance, most of the time in most instances, for the government to act selfishly for its own interests to the exclusion of the interests of other people, at the expense of other people. And unless you're going to take the argument that every program that exists is justifiable in some socially beneficial sense, and in absolute terms, it's not enough to say, yeah, that bridge, one person used it. You have to come up with some kind of calculus to say, do the cost you have to have a cost benefit analysis. You can't just say ipso facto whatever the state, hence the best. Even people within the state, I think, would deny that, since they do actually argue about it from time to time. So I'm not necessarily endorsing an objective theory of value here, or Benthamite ideology, but what I am saying is it's maybe not that dangerous to, in terms of advocacy of a free society, to talk about them, because any method that we use, any attempt at an intellectually honest, empirical basis for the common good is going to lead to conclusions that preclude the state pretty much all the time. I mean, like I said, there might be some market failure areas where maybe there's a room for a vestigial minarchist state, but then given the incentives involved, even that's probably a bad idea. And the thing is, no states that ever have existed have been like that, or even attempted to meet that definition. This is kind of a the state would be justified if, and then that if never happens, because the state's never working on that assumption. The state is always working on the assumption of what's best for it, for its rulers, for its bureaucracy. Now, part of them selling that is they have to say that it's altruistic. They have to say, they can't come out and say, this is what's best for me, so live with it. I'm going to tax you because I want the money to dispense to my friends, and also because I have the will to power and I want to dominate you. They can't say that, so they have to say, I also, I'm always amazed at people like, well, the government doesn't say that it's there to be a tyrant. Well, what's your what are you waiting for? Are you why is it, you know, Walmart's never going to tell you that they're selling you cheap shit either. But that doesn't mean you don't conclude that uh, necessarily. It's just amazing that there's an assumption of benevolence that historically is so unjustifiable as to be ridiculous. The potential of states, all states, to do at bad things, even cutting out the most extreme examples, um, is so tantamount that the idea that that can't happen or that we're not even going to entertain the possibility is naivete. Like, I mean, I thought little children. I mean, I learned about government doing bad things when I was just a very little kid, and my parents weren't a couple of libertarians. They're moderate Democrats. Uh, and if you're going to operate on the assumption that as long as it doesn't say, as long as Obama doesn't say he's committing war crimes, then he's not. It's that simple. And that is very simple. So simple to the point that it's unworthy of even being considered as a plausible explanation of reality. And yet there's a lot of people who that's what, they're waiting for Eric Holder to arrest Barack Obama. And until he does, there's nothing to say. Until they come out and say that welfare is morally hazardous and it's a vote buying scheme that does no good for anyone, and probably is contributing to the destruction of urban society by incentivizing things like single child homes and not working. Unless they admit that explicitly, then they're then it's not that. It's whatever beneficent things they say that it is. So, you know, Germany wasn't aggressing against Poland; they were neutralizing an aggressive threat, because that's what the Germans said. There's never been an aggressive war, basically, because every society says that, with the exception of like Genghis Khan and the Assyrians, that this is not aggressive, that we're doing this defensively. Yeah, that's like, I always am struck by the Assyrians, because they would just come out and say, yeah, we want to slit their throats and take over their country, and it's almost like refreshing their honesty. Um, so that's probably the only society ever where the people were like, yeah, our country's aggressive, or uh, whereas if they come out and said, no, we're liberating the Elamites, um, we're protecting them, and we're protecting them from we're protecting ourselves from Elamite aggression, or Babylonian aggression from Marduk or Shamu Ukin or whoever. A lot of people today would just say, "Well, yeah, of course we're in Iraq to defend ourselves." It's funny with liberals too, because here they were. I mean, on the one hand, they didn't accept that rhetoric when it came from Bush, and now they do when it comes from somebody else with an indistinguishable policy differences. Uh, that's pretty. It's pretty amazing. I mean, if you want to advocate that whatever the government says is the truth, again, because it's a common knowledge that politicians never lie, right? I thought the cliche was that they are only liars. I mean, they don't have to pay for it. They have less disincentive. The elections are so far apart, and they're such a basket of goods. At the end of the day, you could say, yeah, Obama is a liar, but then he's running against someone who's an even bigger liar, which is, when he ran against Romney, it's hard not to say that. Romney flip-flopped enough, you know, that he can lie as much as he wants, and both parties are the same way. What are they going to say? Oh, conservative Christians, you're going to vote for the Democrat? No, they're not. And the DNC can go, oh, blacks or unions, you're going to vote for the RNC? No, they're not. So they can say whatever they want. They can do that, and then there's years away. President has 4 years before he has to worry about. You're going to forget about it. He can always blame everything on somebody else. The economy is such a big, complex thing that he can always say it's not me. And that's what people do, is they tend to have whatever their ideological bias is. And so the liberals are always saying that it's deregulation and capitalism and not enough government regulation when the government's growing every year. Um, so whereas the conservatives are going to say it's because we're getting away from our Christian values, and because we don't have big enough military, even though the military grows every year. That's the reason. I don't know. That's the reason Benghazi happened, is because we didn't have enough aircraft carriers, I guess. Um, Not because we got involved in a war willy nilly. Um, so I guess I'm just saying, if you're really, we can't. It's possible to engage the notion of the common good, not as problematic as it is. I'm not saying it's a silly assumption. When you start getting equivocations, it's the worst thing. It's the worst fallacy, I think. The most annoying one is when they just say, "Well, society hence state." That's whoa. It's a huge equivocation, and then just point out right away. Just trying to go and act like a government agent, act like a police officer, and see what happens. Because the government itself is going to distinguish between you and it, and it's going to treat you a whole hell of a lot different than it treats its own members. All right, so you can say the state's part of society, and you're right, of course it is. It's also distinct from other elements of society. And if you can't recognize that, then you have really bad myopia, or you're being totally intellectually dishonest. That's all I can say. And if you're going to have an intellectually rigorous and honest conception of the common good, it's very hard to see how the state fits that, unless you're going to just say whatever the state does is ipso facto correct. And I think that's ridiculous. I think most people realize intuitively that that's ridiculous, and so they don't explicitly say it, but they will make so many arguments that are based, at the very least, on that implicit assumption, that I think it's something that's worth addressing. So, all right, I'll talk to you all later.